Dr. Njeri Mwageru and the Senior Futurist with a focus on Africa at the Institute for Futures Research. And I'm really pleased to be joined in conversation by the Director of the Institute for Futures Research, Dr. Morne Mostert. And we'll be discussing the idea and concept of prosilience, which is an idea we have begun developing at the Institute for Futures Research. And as we live in these complex, rapidly changing and uncertain times, resilience has become the buzzword, and we're seeing a lot in the media and in discourse and discussion around bouncing back better. And we want to take this opportunity to share a bit more about this new concept we're developing at the Institute for Futures Research on prosilience. So Monet, thank you very much for giving us a bit of your time to take us through in more detail what exactly prosilience is. Could you introduce us to the concept and give us a brief definition?
Yes, and Jerry, thanks so much. It's great to be with you as always. The essence really of the concept is that resilience is not going to help us here. In other words, bouncing back, as the definition often is for resilience, the idea that I return to a so-called status quo ante, the situation I had before the crisis, that's not going to help us here. Why is that? Well, the status quo ante was already undesirable. In other words, even if we succeed in going back, which is anathema for a futurist, but even if we were to succeed, the results would be undesirable. Now, language has limitations. And as new types of events, crises, and phenomena emerge, as they have in this case, the language of resilience now simply seems insufficient. It's gained a lot of traction in the last 50 years or so, the idea of resilience, and that's been mainly because we've had an increase in both frequency and severity of crises. We're now at a point where I think we're entering a new era that requires new language. That language means that we are not tied to the intention of returning to a previous state. We must invent an alternative future state. Hence the idea of moving from resilience, a return to the previous status quo, to prosilience, the invention of an alternative future during a recovery process.
Thank you, Monet. I really like that idea of thinking around prosilience, thinking forward, moving forward, as opposed to resilience, bouncing back to what we had before. But allow me to prod you a little bit more. In 2018, 2019, specifically from an African futures perspective, we were seeing really positive trends, for instance, in terms of economic growth and human development indices. So would there not be a desire to bounce back to a previous 2019 reality? Or why would you encourage us to think around building forward newer?
It's a great challenge to the idea of prosilience. And I'm not denying that there's merit and value in the past. But the temptation, though, to return to the past is just so strong. Now, we experienced this crisis despite all those positive trends, which means the trends that we were able to observe pre-COVID were not sufficient to help us to avert the crisis we have now. And so the idea is, what are the new trends that we should be generating, creating, inventing that may make us more resistant to a future crisis? The reversion to the past is tempting partially because it's informed by romanticization, it's positivistic in the sense that we can see and feel and touch the past, and the future is often riddled with uncertainty. Having said that, humans are characteristically inventive and creative. And the idea of prosilience is to call on that inventive ability so that we can redesign our systems, ourselves, our societies to become a better version of our past and even our current selves.
And talk us through some of the core components of the prosilience model or the concept. How did your thinking around this develop, and what are the main feeding ideas behind it?
it it is important for us as futurists to take what we call a transdisciplinary approach. In other words, we not only do a deep dive into an idea, but we look in terms of scanning, for example, far and wide, and we try to transcend disciplines in that journey of curiosity. We did the same thing here. I looked at systems that experienced trauma, and I looked at the methods employed for recovery in those various systems. And so, for example, I looked at trauma in terms of trauma from sports injuries, for example, and how rehabilitation from sports injuries might occur. I looked at recovery from psychological trauma. I looked at the way that nature recovers from trauma, whether that is in drought or in fire, for example. And that nature idea is very important, and it informed a lot of this model. In the last few decades or so, there's been an increased curiosity in what is known as biophilia, from the original Latin and Greek, a love for nature. And that love for nature extends to a curiosity about how nature may have done things. So the real question was, how does a living system, a biosystem, respond to a crisis? And is there any wisdom in the way that these systems respond to crises as they reinvent themselves? Think about how plants, here in the South African context, how fynbos, for example, responds after a fire. It's not the same fynbos it was before the fire. It reinvents, reinvigorates itself, and in fact propagates itself after the fire. And so a multitude of various recovery models were investigated, even the way that alcoholics are treated, for example, and their recovery process. As I've said, also psychological recovery processes, as a means of trying to create a model that acts as a kind of geolocation almost for senior leaders who are trying to lead their organizations, their systems, their societies through a reinvention process. So really transdisciplinary in nature. And I think what we've produced is something that we're now seeing several of our clients are already starting to use in their own organizational recovery processes.
Absolutely, Monet. The idea of prosilience is one that I, for instance, have had an opportunity to discuss at an African governance seminar series. And myself and a fellow futurist were exploring how to link the idea to prosilience, to a quadruple helix model, and to interject it within governance systems. And I really like this idea of taking a natural sort of perspective on environmental systems and also modes of resistance and resilience that we see around us and applying it to our organizational context. But perhaps share a bit more about how to develop those linkages. You mentioned that the model has come out of an observation of circumstances of trauma. And perhaps explain a bit more as to why you feel in the current era of rapid change and uncertainty, such a focus would be warranted.
Well, the reality is that in the last 50 years, we have seen in terms of the types of change of our natural systems, social systems, and economic systems, not only an increased frequency in disruption, but also an increased severity in disruption. So people often say, yeah, but we've always had change. Yes, that's true, but never at this level of frequency, never at this level of severity. And so the time really asked for the invention of this new model. There are similar related ideas. Some people will be familiar with Nicholas Taleb's work on anti-fragility, for example, the idea of responding to a challenge in a positive way that in fact strengthens you. There are all kinds of innovative ideas in terms of how innovation may be used to move forward. One of my favorite sort of playful ideas, the Japanese concept of shindogu, which is often used just to help people to understand innovation better, which is essentially the idea that something is not necessarily useful or useless. It may just be useless, but nevertheless imaginative. Of course, as we work with organizations, both public and private, we have to give them something a little bit more practical and a little bit more process-driven, process-oriented. The reality is that organizations face these not only increased frequency and increased severity, but also increased complexity, as you said in your introduction, and that's partially driven by a sense of simultaneity. In other words, these things are happening all at the same time. We've got COVID now, but actually, in a way, we're still trying to recover from the alt-right and from the global financial crisis. It's really all happening at the same time. I was inspired also by great literature on kind of recovery processes, among others, the hero's journey, where the hero sets out, experiences profound crisis, returns with a renewed sense of verve and purpose and so on. But what the model really tries to do is that it tries to offer an increased understanding. What the model really tries to do is it tries to offer a better kind of directional orientation, a kind of a structured roadmap to reinvention. You know, people often think of reinvention as just some random ideation process. So how can we structure that? Then it offers, as I've said, a transdisciplinary holistic view on how we can think about multi-stakeholder timing. In other words, how do we time this recovery process in such a way that we don't make it worse as we try to recover? It's also intended as a kind of diagnostic instrument. So organizations can say, well, where am I on this Prosilience process? How well are we doing? And then, of course, you can also use it as a kind of monitoring mechanism, which some clients are now doing. How are we making progress as we reinvent ourselves in the recovery?
So a diagnostic tool, a monitoring instrument, a thinking methodology, these are some great practical examples of how the Prosilience model can be useful to any range of organizations or individuals that are dealing with not only change, as you mentioned, but change that can be particularly severe and whose impacts may be particularly challenging to adapt towards. Perhaps give us a few more practical insights, Monet, as to when the model might be useful. When would a leader, a decision maker, or somebody who's interested in being more prepared for the future consider applying a prosilience approach? When might the idea be most fertile?
I think if you think about what is our default reaction to a crisis? So if you think of a crisis as the sudden and dramatic change and something that presents an appreciable threat, what is our default reaction? Well, it turns out at least one of those default reactions is what we call freezing. It's the idea that you kind of batten down the hatches, you protect yourself, you lock down the gates, and you hide behind the gates, and you hope that the monster passes your door, and when the monster's gone, you can unfreeze again and continue with your real world. Well, that kind of response, if that's one alternative to traditional resilience, is only really useful for very short-term crises. What we're realizing now is that we're really dealing with a long-term crisis. And it's true that some organizations have flourished during COVID. That's the reality. They were just sort of, they had the right surfboard on the right wave, and when that wave came, they were ready to run it. But that story we know is not going to last forever either, as the market will almost certainly rebalance itself, not only with new competitors, but also with a kind of price consolidation on the markets. Many other organizations, of course, have suffered severely, and some have already begun to reinvent themselves. Of course, the old working from home idea is now generally pervasive. But what the model encourages, I think, very practically, is a revision of the kind of future that has now been reinvented by the crisis. In other words, rather than use the past as the template for recovery, what if we use the future? And that means that when we talk about, for example, rehabilitating the organization, we deliberately change the language to prohabilitating the organization. That is, as we are starting to experiment with new ideas, new product ranges, new processes, new models for customer engagement, new propositions for investors, we're not doing those on the recipes of the past. We're not even doing those on the challenges of the present. We are prohabilitating ourselves towards a preferred future. That means as we are regenerating ourselves, we are in fact, as we would say in this model, pro-generating ourselves, creating, healing ourselves towards a different alternative. We're not just moving towards resynthesis, which is putting all these broken blocks back together again, because that would give you the past. We encourage prosynthesis rather than resynthesis. In other words, putting these blocks together again in a way that makes us more resistant to similar challenges in the past. Then perhaps a kind of reflection step in the model is what we've called a recognition of the scarring. Just to understand that when systems experience a level of trauma as we've now all had, there will be long-term consequences of that scarring. Even if you were able to recover, there will be memory, there will be phantom limbs, there will be post-traumatic stress disorder, those markers in time of 2021, 2022 will be present there for decades to come. And just recognizing that may help us to be a little bit more creative. And then, very importantly and very practically, Jerry, let's make sure that we've learned something from this. And we've called that that process a kind of almost pro-learning, provention, so that when the next crisis hits us, we don't have to experience the same cycle of trauma and take as long to recover. But the provention has meant that we've learned about the nature of disruption and about the nature of our own identity as societies, as organizations, as individuals, and how we may respond more elegantly. So that finally we get to a place where we have, in fact, it's almost a cliche for a futurist now, but we have embarked on a so-called new paradigm where we are self-organizing around a new future-based set of principles. I think it's a conceptual model, but what it helps people to do, and I've just shared the kind of latter, more practical stages of that model, is to plot themselves and say, how well have we done on each one of these? I'll pick just one step and then conclude on this, that one of the steps in the early stages in the process, having removed yourself from the danger, is to take some time for what the model calls, conscious care. Just stop and rest. Make yourself safe. I think many organizations have been so consumed with the idea of business continuity that the idea of self-care to some degree has suffered. And that's not only physiologically, health-wise, but also psychologically. The reality is, of course, that as humans, our lives are a lot more holistic. Think about the school system. The school system, for example, has really based its own response on a kind of where business looked at business continuity. Schools often looked at curriculum continuity. Well, we know, of course, when we have a moment to reflect, that an education is not the completion of a curriculum. It is a much richer experience than that. And so one of the risks without those reflection points is that we simply try to complete what we can of the old model. If we do that, the consequences could be severe. Bear in mind, crises often hatch new competitors. If you look at the global financial crisis, a long list of well-known companies were hatched during or just after the global financial crisis. The same thing will happen here. So this is not a theoretical construct. This is a strategically critical construct to understand that you reinvent yourself also to be sustainably competitive post the crisis.
I really appreciate you talking us through some of the practical application aspects of the very conceptual model. And so many interesting ideas have come out: biophilia, provention as part of prosilience, but also these concepts of conscious care, healing, and also scarring. The idea that as much as we may want to, Monet, the past may actually not be recoverable. The environment will change, the landscape will change, competitors may change, the markets and the challenges we face will be different. So Prosilience is really a way of not only bringing a new way of thinking, but shaping the language as well to orient our thinking in this way. Where could we find more information around some of these ideas? Where could we read more about the model, Monet, if anybody wanted to understand a bit more about Prosilience and perhaps apply it as well?
Well, and Jerry, the birth of the idea of prosilience as it's used here was really in 2017 with a short paper I wrote for the International Labour Organization. And so if people just Google me and the idea, they'll find it. It was applied in that context to the future of work. The media has had a significant interest, and including in the financial media. But the IFR has also published a formal paper as part of its own annual Business Futures publication, and people are very welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to share some of that with them.
Thank you very much, Monet, for sharing about Prosilience, letting us know a bit more about the concept, why it's useful to think in this way, and how we can practically apply it in our work, in our professional and personal lives. And I'm sure we will be sharing much more as we develop this approach within the IFR. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing a lot more products and engagements come from Prosilience. So thanks very much for talking us through it.
Thank you so much, and Jerry. I'll conclude on this, that every risk and every opportunity can only be found in the future. Let us reinvent ourselves for that future, and Prosilience is a strong contender.
Thank you, Monet.
Thank you.